What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Deku story. What if Deku was neglected by his mother and raised by a goddess? If you enjoyed, then please like, share and do comments. 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 18 minutes and 43 seconds, give or take the amount of time he spent asleep and lost track of his counting. Factoring in that information, it was reasonable to assume that he may have skipped over a month or two in his count, but he was beyond caring at this point. In any case, he'd spent roughly that amount of time imprisoned here, restrained in this infernal chair. It wasn't even comfortable. Izuku had a lot of time on his restrained hands to think about random subjects, from the sciences to philosophical debate, but eventually even those trains of thought had reached their destination and he was forced to ponder others to occupy the time. Namely, random bullshit that didn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things. If Izuku was being honest with himself, and he was forcing himself to do that a lot more in the vain hope that whatever God saw fit to deliver unto him this punishment would forgive him should he atone for whatever it was he had done wrong. Currently, the best guess for his sin was how dishonest he had been with everyone, even if he told himself it was for a good reason. Protecting All Might. Wait. He got distracted again. He was thinking about the chair, yes. He loathed this chair. Right, he got distracted again. If he was being honest with himself, he'd prefer being stuck inside those plastic things bolted to the desks back in Class 1A. The one he was currently strapped into had no padding, no arch support, no ergonomics, and was the very definition of brutalist architecture in chair format. Class 1A. Izuku shook his head to dispel the intrusive thoughts, doing his best to disregard his past life. The medical mask on his face pumping oxygen into his damaged lungs slid uncomfortably around scarred skin as he did so. Simultaneously, the barrels of 6 different ceiling-mounted machine guns adjusted their aim ever so slightly, zeroing in on his head and chest as they subtly shifted around. Still, he felt assured that they wouldn't fire. So long as he didn't activate, or think about activating, any quirks, nothing would happen. He learned that the hard way mere minutes after he first woke up in the body of All for One. It was really drilled into his skull what would occur when his new, super regeneration quirk kicked in immediately after he was shot, causing every gun in the vicinity to unleash holy hellfire on the undying corpse sitting in the chair. It took a manual override from the control room situated off to his right to force the firing to stop, and even then, he was subjected to painful electrical shocks until he fell unconscious. All of that just so the damned doctors of this facility could come and reconnect his battered body to that accursed life support machine. Perhaps the worst part of this whole situation was that no one spoke to him beyond demanding he respond to the doctor that stopped by occasionally to ask questions about his health. Even when he was being fed by an attendant, he wasn't talked to, nor were his words acknowledged. Izuku was no stranger to social isolation. His childhood was practically filled with nothing but that, in between getting yelled at and burned by Kachan, but even then, he had his mother to chat with at the end of the day. His lifeboat. Here, he had nothing. Of course, he tried to talk after the doctors were done strapping him back in a bullet-hole-free straitjacket and explained the situation to them. How he had stupidly thrown himself into oncoming traffic to save the life of a little girl whose ball had rolled away from her onto the street, pushing her clear and taking the impact himself. How he was actually Izuku Midoriya, aspiring hero and All Might fanatic. How bringing down any one member of faculty from UA to just hear him out would clear up this misunderstanding, and they could work on a plan for fixing the situation he found himself in. The first week of his constant pleading, he was reminded with an automated message that prisoners should not speak unless spoken to. The second week, guards started loudly demanding over the intercom that he shut up and take his punishment, like a man. On the third week, those assigned to guard him had enough and forced the mounted guns to fire on the restrained figure, and he spent 10 agonizing minutes in hell as super regeneration kicked in, repairing all the damage he suffered at the cost of forcing the quirk-activated guns to keep firing. He'd never felt so glad when the high-voltage electric shocks knocked him unconscious. That was the last time anyone had talked to him beyond barking orders, when the warden announced an annoyed and clearly insincere apology for his staff's behavior over the intercom, assuring Izuku that they would be going through a mandatory, 10-minute corrective training course. He could practically hear the sneer in his apology. Unlike when he had broken his bones intentionally while still getting used to One for All, Izuku decided to actually take a lesson from the literal torture he'd suffered through in what he termed the third week, and shut the hell up. All of this meant that for the last, what was it now? It had probably been at least 10 minutes since his last count. Yeah, that sounded about right. All of this meant that for the last 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 28 minutes and 39 seconds, he had been imprisoned in Tartarus, unmoving and unspeaking unless directed to. Since he couldn't do much else, Izuku spent much of his time pondering the one whose body his consciousness now resided inside and explored every nook and cranny of its mind. What remained of All for One seemed fragmented though. At least, that's the best way Izuku could explain it. It was as if Izuku had moved into a new house, or in this case a body, and the previous owner left behind some of his furniture and personal belongings. As much as he wanted to deny it, he admitted there was a 99% chance that there was a not so subtle difference between the Izuku who had thrown himself in front of the truck and the Izuku currently strapped into this angular, blocky excuse for a chair. Smintas probably would have created something more comfortable for God's sake. Wait, no. He was getting distracted again. What was he? Yes. His mental shifts. It was like, the insides of All for One had been scooped out and replaced with Izuku, and the remaining outer layer of the villain had combined with its new innards. The thought that All for One was entirely whole, buried deep inside his mind and just waiting to escape flashed through his mind yet again. But whenever he tried to search for the villain inside his head, he found mostly nothing. Something approaching emptiness. Izuku could and at one point had distanced himself from the mental leftovers of the villain, but after the third week, he gave up. His mental state had been in a worse place than that time All Might told him to give up, and he honestly couldn't find any sort of reason to live. He had nothing to look forward to, after all. When he was a kid, he could comfort himself with his dream of being a hero, but in Tartarus, there was no future. Just whatever restraint system you happened to be strapped into. After that third week, Izuku reached out and touched those mental remnants of All for One with the explicit purpose of hoping the villain would reassert control over the body and kill off Midoriya's consciousness. Wait, no. After that third week, Izuku reached out and touched those mental remnants of All for One just to see what would happen. An experiment, really. All Izuku learned was that if All for One was actually hiding out in this body still, he was doing a damn good job of it. A second thing he learned was that if he reached out and touched those mental remnants of All for One, he got a sort of perspective shift. Those bits would jump out and wrap around himself like a coat, coloring his every thought. Basically, it merged Izuku's own mind with what was left of All for One, and he would think differently as a result. It frightened him a bit on some days, but at the same time, Izuku could never bring himself to let go of the security. It was quite literally the only thing Izuku had to comfort him, and as such he never really stopped using it. He wasn't entirely sure if he could at this point, nor did he particularly want to. While he didn't always like the roads his new thoughts went down sometimes, the benefits of All for One's superior mental stability outweighed some of the darker aspects that occasionally flitted across his consciousness. Again, it didn't transform him into an entirely different person, but it certainly provided a major personality shift. His first clue that was true came from the fact that he was readily swearing like a sailor at every available opportunity, because while before the worst thing he'd uttered in his previous life was a single shit whilst fighting villains, now he could potentially rival Bakugo with how many fucks he threw about like candy. The second clue came when he tried to analyze the events leading up to his consciousness swap, and how he had saved the little girl. Or at least, Izuku hoped he saved her. Yeah, he saved her from the semi-truck, that much he could remember before everything went dark, but the little girl was still on the road, he only pushed her away from the immediate threat. Still, he liked to think that his bloodied corpse frightened enough of the drivers on the road into slowing down or stopping altogether. Hey. He shook his head once more to dispel the humorous image of his classmates gazing down with tear-filled eyes as the hero wannabe Deku lay broken and bleeding in the road. No. That right there. That was exactly what those darker aspects he mentioned earlier were like. What part of his bleeding and broken corpse was funny? That was disgusting. Sighing, he forced his thoughts to go back to when he saved the child. As per usual when he thought of the event, a new, instinctive reaction appeared. A new thought that he knew he'd not had before. Why? Why would he dive in front of the truck? If Izuku had tear ducts, he'd be crying right now, and if he had eyes, they'd be watery. As it was, all he could do was take short, shaky breaths as his damaged respiratory system shuddered. He knew the answer, because it's what a hero would do. It didn't matter what happened to him, if he could save somebody, then he would do it without hesitation, no matter the person. If Shigaraki was hanging off a ledge and about to fall, Izuku knew he'd be the first person to reach out a hand and save him. But why? This was his life now. For all the issues it brought though, all the strange, hypocritical thoughts and doubts it sowed into Izuku's skull, he still couldn't bear to part with it. The sole reason he had for even wanting to distance himself from All for One's remnants was that ever-present idea the villain was still hiding inside, waiting to reassert control over his body. The more he thought about it though, the more certain Izuku became that that wasn't the case. He was 96% sure that his old body was dead. Right before he found himself in this one, he felt, well, everything inside his old one break. His organs exploded from the force of the hit, and shattered ribs punctured anything that remained marginally functional inside his chest cavity. One of the many theories he'd come up with during his time in the chair was that he underwent a consciousness swap, not just a replacement. By that, he meant that All for One's mind had entered Izuku's body, and Izuku entered All for One's, with each side leaving behind little psychic imprints, or remnants, whatever you wanted to call them. He heard mumbling from the guards occasionally, sometimes they even purposely left the intercom on so they could taunt him with their conversation, though any attempt to communicate back would be met with a shock. They talked about their jobs and the prisoners they watched over, and even villains that were at large and expected to be transferred to Tartarus upon their capture, but he never heard anything about Midoriya. Or rather, his old body. Knowing All for One, he wouldn't just turn over a new leaf and try to live a normal life. He'd crawl his way back into a position of power by using Izuku's body and would have murdered everyone at Ua by now, or at the very least All Might. Plus, when the guards mentioned a while back that All Might had made a rather emotional televised statement about traffic safety, citing the death of one of his students, Izuku knew. His old body was dead, and any consciousness that resided inside his body at that time had died with it. For probably the millionth time in his relatively short new life, Izuku shook his head. It was so easy to get distracted. Right, All for One hiding out in his mental skinsuit that Izuku liked to wear. What's the probability? About 8%, if he had to hazard a guess. That was another thing he'd picked up. He now liked to think of things in terms of percentages, and found comfort in compartmentalizing information into handy numbers. Perhaps it was due to an intelligence-boosting quirk or something, maybe one that allowed him to do math really well. It'd certainly explain why whenever he thought back to old math problems he'd done in the past, he readily found the answer popped into his head like he had a calculator on his person at all times. He sighed again. It really was a low point in his life when he started redoing old math tests in his head just to stave off the boredom. Couldn't they have at least given him like, a TV or something? Wait, he had no eyes. How could he keep forgetting that? There were exactly two things that prevented him from just offing himself. 1. Super regeneration. That damnable quirk seemingly had no drawback whatsoever, besides being unable to heal scarred tissue or wounds that were cauterized. Basically, the wound needed to be fresh. In any case, there was the distinct possibility that Izuku snapping his own neck by utilizing one of his many strength augmentation quirks would just result in his neck being healed, and while he had an idea of how to permanently end himself, he didn't know how he'd be able to move his arm into a position that would allow him to decapitate himself. The restraints keeping him immobilized may have looked like plain cloth and nylon, but they were as strong as steel. He could undoubtedly break out of them, but not before the guns or electric shocks immobilized him. Secondly, and more importantly, he had a new goal. While he couldn't use any one of the vast multitude of quirks housed in All for One's body due to the guns pointed at him, pain has a way of making one lose the concentration required to utilize a quirk properly. After all, he was able to sort of peruse his inventory. Take stock of what he owned. Izuku sighed. He didn't own these quirks, every single one of them beyond the original was stolen. Every single one, besides All for One. A smile came to his thin, damaged lips which he quickly crushed. It was ironic, really. The more Izuku thought about it, the more he realized that the names should have been switched around. One for all and all for one, it would have been a more apt description if their names were swapped. All Might's former quirk, One for All, contained the very souls of those who had the quirk in the past which he would have really liked to know before he accepted it, All Might in addition to any quirks that the users themselves had. They combined into the core of One for All, and gave its current user that incredible power. All of its previous users' quirks, for one person to use. Well, that one person being him, anyways. Apparently, that was a new thing that not even the vestiges of the previous users seemed to know about. Or rather, now that Izuku could re-examine his few interactions with them through the lens of All for One, they seemed to have had an idea but wouldn't voice it. Why? He didn't know and honestly didn't care. The quirk wasn't his anymore, it wasn't anybody's anymore unless Ua did some serious necromancy to salvage the quirk which, considering how important One for All was, might not be too far off from reality, so there was no point in puzzling over something that he'd never get answers to. Meanwhile, the quirk All for One certainly had the capability of stealing quirks from others. The several hundred that Izuku could feel inside of him was a testament to that, but it could also give them to people. One single quirk, that could give power to anybody. If only All for One had been a nicer person. He would have made for a great hero. Wait, he got distracted again. His head shook more, finding the ability to chuckle lightly as he imagined what the guns pointed at his head looked like as they danced with his movements. He'd have used his infrared vision quirk to actually see it, but he'd have been shot for doing so. As he had been multiple times in the past, the most recent time being about 2 weeks back, come to think of it. For now, he'd just have to continue to suffer in the darkness. He sighed. Idly, he noticed he tended to do that quite a lot. Right, his goal, his new dream. The one thing he had to keep him going in this world. He didn't want to be a hero anymore. Maybe it was that little bit of All for One that was now stuck atop his consciousness, maybe it was the deep-seated hatred he had begun to fester within himself when the guards read a letter addressed to him written by his former homeroom teacher. The one where he spelled out his complete and total disinterest in meeting with the man, in addition to the lack of caring showcased by apparently every other staff member at the school, a not at all subtle warning to never speak Izuku's name ever again, accompanied by a very nice reminder to eat healthy and exercise properly. Exercise in Tartarus amounted to the electrodes placed around his body being activated at a low voltage to keep his muscles from atrophying, plus a foul-tasting cocktail of drugs and vitamins to eat with his nutrient slop that was served in place of actual food. He didn't exactly blame Aizawa, or anyone else for that matter though. He knew what it sounded like. Still, if they had just sent down somebody, anybody at all, he might have had an opportunity to get out of here. They denied him even that. Weren't heroes supposed to help everybody, even their worst enemies? That's what being a hero was all about. Butting into things where they didn't belong if they noticed something was amiss. Still, that didn't mean he wanted to be a villain. The very thought of hurting someone, even the idea of taking someone else's quirk forcefully, it sickened him. He could never do that. With one exception. But he'd get to that later. No, he had one very simple goal, and a plan for the future. Searching through his vast inventory of quirks, he'd stumbled across one he'd worked with in his past life. When he was still Deku. He'd found Search, Ragdoll's stolen quirk. Curiously, he also understood that it wasn't the original quirk he had, but rather a copy. He didn't have access to All for One's memories beyond a few fragmented bits and pieces, and all of them were random. The fact that about 20 of them appeared to be of him eating food was testament to that. But one of the memory fragments he had was of All for One talking with his close confidant and doctor, about his quirk replication procedure. He was a little confused at first, once he got over the, "Please help me, I'm not All for One, really, come on guys" thing and started to just poke his quirks around, because despite the sheer number of them inside him, he felt hollow. Still did, really. His best guess was that these quirk copies, while functional, were comparable to an animatronic version of a real person. It imitated a real thing, but it wasn't the real thing, and he could feel it. Each quirk felt like it was missing something, which was why he instinctively knew that All for One was currently holding onto a carbon copy of Ragdoll's quirk, as well as his own quirk. All for One, side note, who the hell names themselves after their own damn quirk? That shit's confusing at the best of times. As if that wasn't strange enough, Izuku all but knew the current holder of the original version of both of those quirks was Tamura Shigaraki. Or he soon would be. Through the scraps of memories he could pick through, Izuku understood that All For One wanted Shigaraki to have his quirk and follow in his footsteps, though not in the way Shigaraki wanted, which, really, Izuku always privately suspected was the case. Whether or not that had occurred yet was something that Izuku was unsure of. He didn't really get access to outside information here. Still, the guards weren't acting like the world outside was ending, so he felt confident Shigaraki wasn't in control of the power yet, and quite possibly never would be. In any case, Shigaraki wasn't his problem anymore. Was it callous to think that? Perhaps. But Izuku was tired. Tired of everything. He just wanted to wake up, go to school with his friends, and be happy. He hadn't felt happiness in a long time until he went to UA and acquired his first honest-to-goodness friends in too many years. He missed his friends. As of now, he hadn't felt happiness for 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 34 minutes and 11 seconds. He'd take the raw deal of waking up as a quirkless weakling again too, at least then he'd get to hug his mother, tell her he loved her, and eat her katsudon once more. He missed katsudon. He smashed his skull into the back of his chair, eliciting a warning beep from the machine as the guns trained more closely on him. He knew the guards were on alert as well, intently watching his movements. But he didn't care. He just needed to forget all of that. Izuku Midoriya was dead. All that was left was, whoever the fuck he currently was now. Some twisted version of his old self. His goal was simple. He was going to get out of this hellhole, somehow, someway, and he was going to do one final act of good. He refused to die in this body without having helped anybody. He was going to find Ragdoll and give her back the quirk she'd had forcefully ripped out of her body, so she could resume her work as a pro hero. He knew what being quirkless was like. But having a quirk all your life and then having it ripped away, it must be some kind of hell. Especially when her teammates continued to operate just fine without her direct assistance. As for Izuku himself, well, he wasn't sure. A part of him was screaming for him to just end it, to kill himself. But he'd been in situations like this before. Well, not like Tartarus but, suicidal thoughts. He'd battled with them before, so he knew from experience that waiting for a new day can really change one's outlook. So, while right now he couldn't find a reason to live beyond helping Ragdoll, he did understand that he may find a new one after he completed his goal. One thing he was entirely certain of, however, is that he wasn't going to try and go back to his old life. Izuku Midoriya was dead. He'd been dead for quite some time. Ignoring that little voice in the back of his head that told him nobody cared, Izuku understood that people mourned for him. His classmates, his mother, All Might. Aizawa himself probably skipped school for a few days to hide in his house. Izuku knew that the gruff man actually did care a great deal about his students. That was just it though. It wasn't fair to them. Izuku couldn't just try and step back into those bright red shoes he always wore and go about life like nothing happened. Not to mention, he was now in possession of one of the most powerful quirks in existence. And several hundred others. He was a liability. A major security risk. Even if through some magical means, the entire truth about Izuku's situation came to light, and people believed it, it wouldn't matter. He was a walking nightmare on legs, and all his friends, no. All his former friends' hands would be tied on the matter. No amount of representative with All Might or Rua would prevent Izuku from just being thrown back in Tartarus or some other similar prison for safety reasons. And to be honest, Izuku understood. Truly. He knew the man whose body he now inhabited. Plus, with the possibility that All For One was still lurking somewhere in the depths of his mind, he could potentially be a ticking time bomb. Coincidentally, time bomb that was another quirk that Izuku understood he possessed. It was one he had filed under a mental cabinet labeled, useless, because the quirk activated upon his death and would cause all of his organs to swell with blood and then explode. Not even in a destructive blast either, they'd just swell and burst pathetically, unlikely to even rupture through his dermal layer. Why All For One ever decided he needed to steal that quirk from somebody, Izuku didn't understand. It was, however, nice that All For One, the quirk, seemed to come with the ability to have a basic understanding of how to utilize any quirks that were stolen with it. Izuku shook his head again. He kept getting distracted, right, life after succeeding with his goal. To recap, didn't want to be a hero, was never going to be a villain in this life or the next beyond the obvious illegal acts he'd be committing by breaking out of prison and then whatever he had to do to successfully hide out, and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to kill himself. That left one last option he could think of, and it seemed pretty appealing to him. Just running away. Going off and living the life he seemed destined for at birth, that of a nobody. Not that he was saying being a nobody was bad, mind you, but just being your average citizen. Didn't get in trouble with the law, maybe had a family, and never accomplished anything noteworthy in life. That sounded quite appealing to Izuku right about now. A family was something he hardly gave a second thought to in the past, since he was so young, had so many goals and desires to fulfill. Now that he had literally nothing but spare time on his hands though, he often thought about the what-ifs. What could have been? What may come? Izuku liked the idea of being a dad, it sounded nice. He couldn't even remember what his own father looked like, and that hurt. All he had was the occasional phone call, not even pictures. It hurt when his mom dodged the question of whether or not Izuku could be a hero without a quirk. He wouldn't make those same mistakes. If his son or daughter happened to be quirkless and still wanted to be a great hero, well, who was Izuku to deny them that wish? After all, he had a literal arsenal of quirks they could freely pick and choose from. He could probably give them multiple ones if they really wanted. The idea of suicide receded farther and farther back in Izuku's mind as he imagined a life where he had someone he loved at his side, and a beautiful child or two between them. Perhaps it was the social isolation and borderline torture he was going through that brought out all these thoughts, but the idea of family, the inseparable bond of blood and love, he wanted it more than he'd ever wanted to be a hero. Well, maybe not more than his previous desire to be a hero. But that was in a past life. The world had moved on from Izuku Midoriya, and it was time he moved on too. The only thing standing between him and Ragdoll, and by extension his eventual quiet life after helping her, was several thousand tons of steel-reinforced concrete, armed guards, automated defense systems, and his crippling injuries that literally kept him more restrained than the actual physical restraints to this worthless excuse of a chair. The life support monitors rapidly beeped as his heart rate skyrocketed and he momentarily lost his cool, thrashing about in a desperate bid to achieve any modicum of comfort on the slab. Prisoner 5687, cease your actions at once and maybe if you fucks invested any money at all into, I don't know, goddamned pillows, I might consider calming down. He screamed, devoid of any emotion beyond blind rage. His voice, deep and hollow with scratchy undertones, resonated throughout the cell he called his room. Izuku missed his old voice. He was rewarded for his actions with several painful electric shocks. He didn't care anymore though, continuing to cackle madly as his body convulsed. It almost hurt more, all the tubes and wires jammed into his throat being jostled around by his rancorous laughter, not to mention his lungs failing to intake the necessary amount of air for his actions. Surprisingly, after 10 or so more seconds, the electricity actually cut off. Code Lavender. Understood, Sir. We'll be. Izuku managed to make out the sounds of several chairs being rapidly shoved to the side and boots trundling out of the observation room, likely leaving just a skeleton crew behind the observation window. Code Lavender. Izuku believed that to be code used when a prisoner was being difficult to move from room to room and presented an escape risk. He was quite thankful that the guards decided to give each other a pop quiz on protocols about a year back with the intercom on. It gave him quite a bit of information on what all of the code phrases meant. Taking a deep breath, or as deep as he could without hurting his damaged lungs and throat, Izuku managed to calm himself down a bit once he realized no guards were going to rush into the room to beat him up or anything. That hadn't happened yet, actually. Though they could be liberal with their automated firearm usage. Their electricity bill must be pretty high too. He chuckled at that, a small pitiful chuckle that hurt his ragged and abused throat and made the blood in the back of his esophagus churn about, but he chuckled all the same. He was going to escape this place, even with the risk of all for one waiting for exactly that to happen. He knew he should care, but he really didn't have it in him to think about others right now. He needed to be out of this godforsaken place. He'd actually conjured up some pretty grandiose escape plans that had been thought out thoroughly and down to the last detail. He always skipped a single step though. How to initiate them. He knew exactly how to escape as soon as he was able to exit the room he was currently in. He could probably even squeeze out of here riddled with bullets assuming he was freed from this chair. That was just it though, he couldn't get past the first stage of the game. Now he was sounding like Tamura. He was going to disregard that information for now however, and just go over what he'd do assuming he wasn't tied to the chair. Nearly a year prior, he'd purposely thrashed around until the wires in his neck fell out, and his ventilator ceased functioning. Before the shocks knocked him out so the medics could re-enter and plug him back in, he noticed something. He could still breathe. It hurt like hell, and he knew he wouldn't be able to keep it up forever like that, but he could still breathe. He wagered he could force himself to do that for about 5 minutes before it became too much for his body, and then he'd need external assistance in the form of an advanced respirator. At first, he figured he'd break free and meander his way towards the nearest medical station and force one of the doctors to jury-rig up some sort of breathing apparatus to keep him steady, or perhaps bust out of the prison altogether and make a beeline for the closest hospital he could find and demand treatment. Eventually though, he remembered something. Kai Chisaki was imprisoned in Tartarus. He'd seen the news report. Chisaki was found screaming on the highway and missing both hands, unable to use his quirk, the handiwork of Tamura. But, he still possessed it. His quirk was still in him, it's just that his quirk factor, his hands, were gone, leaving him unable to activate it. If Izuku could get out of this room, he'd be able to find Kai. How? Quite simply, he'd warp the man right to him. All Might had told him about the warping quirk utilized by All for One on Kacchan after he was kidnapped by the League of Villains, where he vomited a foul-smelling black liquid and was teleported away. If the quirk sensing guns all around him were turned off, he'd be able to activate Ragdoll's power, locate Kai with literal ease and then warp his body right in front of him. He'd steal that child-harming bastard's quirk and then use it to heal himself. He'd seen Kai use his abilities to fix damage to his own body and those of others, and he'd painfully sat through some of Eri's therapy sessions in a show of support while she described how Kai would rip her apart molecule by molecule and then piece her back together as if nothing had happened. Just because the damage was healed, didn't mean the pain being vivisected was any less excruciating. Once he got a hold of Kai's quirk, he'd be able to repair all the damage that this body had acquired and then GTFO, assuming he didn't pass out from the pain of using it on himself. Well, he'd GTFO right after tearing Kai's body apart a few times and piecing him back together. No, he'd fix him. He'd give him back the hands he lost to Tamura on the highway. Right after he stole his precious quirk from him. It'd be the perfect torture. He'd have the tools to utilize his quirk back, and he'd be unable to do anything at all with it. Then again, why couldn't he tear Kai apart, put him back together, and then return his hands? Yes, that was good. He'd make sure he suffered for what he did to Sir Night-Eye, Mirio, and Eri. He really was thinking like All for One now, wasn't he? Honestly though, he didn't care. Yes. Ha 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 ha, guck. Sputtering, Izuku hacked up a small amount of blood as his emotions continued to get the best of him. Hey, at least he was acting more like All Might now. It was practically that man's hobby to spit up blood. Izuku couldn't stifle the chuckle his dark thoughts caused, nor could he stop the consequence of said chuckle, namely the tube he noticed falling out of his neck. That probably wasn't good. Any second now the shocks would come though, and the doctors would have him hooked back into his life support system so he could get back to his fantasizing. At least, that's what should have happened. Instead, well, the rapid beeping on the heart monitor was probably a good sign of how Izuku was feeling. While Izuku couldn't see it, the lights in his room shut down and beyond the dull thud of his heartbeat, he could swear he heard the sound of all the ceiling-mounted machine guns suddenly going slack, banging their chassis against the wall as they powered down. Deciding he really didn't have anything to lose beyond suffering a bit more pain, he took a risk and activated his infrared vision. Deep blues, bright yellows, clear greens, and burning reds filled up his vision, as the quirk quickly kicked in. The heat emitted from the objects changing the colors he saw, and quite simply, red meant hot, blue meant cool. He was able to easily distinguish everything in the room, and could perceive the depth, distance, and the size, shape of everything as well. Honestly, it was exceptionally close to what normal eyesight looked like, just with thermal imaging layered atop it. Hey, Izuku wasn't about to look a gift quirk in the mouth. Another great thing Izuku had noticed, he wasn't getting shot. He wasn't being shocked. He could faintly hear the sounds of panic from the guards coming through the glass of the observation window, but this was it. He could fulfill his goal if he acted now. If he channeled his inner all for one and was truly ruthless. He would try his best not to kill or harm anyone, but he was getting out of here. Tonight. Oh, and Kai was the exception to his self-imposed rules. Sorry, not sorry, Chisaki, he rasped, before putting his plan into motion. Izuku quickly activated one of the quirks he had seen All for One utilizing against All Might in his final battle, spear-like bones. Izuku barely gave a passing thought to the, spear-like bones as they protruded through the skin on his arms and was pleasantly surprised to find that they didn't hurt him at all as they exited his skin. Then again, maybe he just could feel that pain thanks to all the other torment his body was going through. The flaw in his plan was soon discovered, however, as Izuku realized he couldn't exactly cut his way out of the exceptionally strong straitjacket with his immobile limbs. He did succeed in making 2 holes in the side of his straitjacket though. Canceling the quirk, he rapidly applied 2 separate strength enhancers through his body, grinning as he felt his muscles bulge and tighten a bit in response. Well, he supposed one last callback wouldn't hurt too much, right? One last hurrah, as it was. Just like All Might said, he whispered to the empty room, clench your butt cheeks and yell, SMAAASH. Izuku's arms easily broke free of the jacket, the X-shaped keypad buckling him into the chair flew off as well, smashing against the farthest wall and crumbling into various mechanical bits and circuitry. While standing up after not having moved one's legs much for over 2 years may have been difficult for others, Izuku's strength enhancers thankfully augmented the minuscule muscles that remained behind in the limbs. What all of this really meant though was that Izuku had no issue at all with standing up and kicking that infernal chair directly through the observation window where a skeleton crew of 2 guards cowered away in the corner from the deadly force now freed from his restraints. Izuku didn't even feel pain when the tubes were ripped from his throat, so great was his excitement. He had no time to get distracted though, those guns could come online at any time. Glancing behind him, he vetoed the idea of punching his way through the likely locked vault-like door that served as the entrance to his cell. It wasn't that Izuku felt he couldn't do it, but he was already feeling a bit tired from how he had exerted himself. He needed to get somewhere without the automated turrets, so he could warp Kai to him and heal himself. Turning back to the now smashed window of the observation room, Izuku ignored the burning in his lungs and throat as he vaulted over the shattered glass, not bothering to cover his hands. He just let super regeneration heal the deep cut his palm suffered from grabbing onto the jagged material as he bypassed the terrified guards and opened the door that was the staff entrance. Time seemed to freeze as soon as he stepped into the somewhat narrow hallway that connected all the observation rooms to one another. On either side, Tartarus guards froze in fear at the scarred figure of All for One panting heavily in the middle of their walkway, unsure of how to proceed. Their hesitancy allowed Izuku all the time he needed to apply spring-like limbs to himself, before pointing his open palms up and down the hallway. BWOOM. Izuku found himself unable to keep the smile from his face as he activated All for One's favorite quirk, air cannons, watching through his thermal vision as everyone in the hallway was blown respectably far off their feet and, more importantly, away from Izuku's position. Additionally, any doors that happened to be open in the hall as well found themselves slammed shut or ripped off their very hinges. Because he hadn't applied as many quirks to himself as All for One had in the Kamino ward, it wasn't nearly the destructive typhoon that the cameras had recorded in his fight against All Might, but it was still a force to be reckoned with. He'd just need to hide inside one of these rooms for a moment to complete his plan. Taking a few steps to the left, he entered the observation room next to his own and slammed the door shut, quickly jamming an office chair that was unlucky enough to be next to him under the door handle to buy himself a bit more time. By now, he could hear panic all over the place. He was pretty sure that the way the entire building seemed to shake in the flickering lights above him meant that there were plenty of other criminals loose. Plus, he could hear the prison guards panicking out there in the hallway, loudly debating on entering the room or waiting for armored support before proceeding. The loud alarm blaring over the prison's intercom system also clued him in. Izuku frowned as he finally noticed the single guard that was still in the room, slowly reaching for the gun on his waistband. There were always complications in his life. Black spots danced around the edges of his thermal vision as breathing became more and more tortuous with each passing second, but Izuku still managed to whisper out. His voice was more akin to sandpaper than anything else at this point, "Touch that, and your quirk is mine." It seemed like something All for One might say, in any case. Even if it wasn't, it certainly had the effect he wanted as the trembling man's hands suddenly shot up directly in the air, a clear sign of surrender. Izuku approached and disarmed the guard, readying himself to toss the gun into the corner of the room. A quizzical look crossed what remained of his face right before he did though. Shrugging, Izuku activated another quirk he had made a note of, hot hands, and turned his palm into a biological smelter. The gun rapidly became red hot in the face of such astonishing temperatures, quickly turning to metal sludge. The mortified look on the guard's face was all the reward Izuku needed to know his plan had worked. He wasn't going to be trying anything heroic. Turning off all non-essential quirks, meaning everything beyond a single strength enhancer to keep his legs stable, he activated Ragdoll's search. Perhaps it was because he had fought the villain before and met him in person, but Kai's presence was rapidly located. In fact, it was the first person he sensed. Actually, there was an 87% certainty that Search was locating those he had previously interacted with in the past because after that, he zeroed in on Muscular, Moonfish, and the presence of someone young, whom he somehow instinctively knew to be named Mustard, from the attack on the training camp all those months ago. He chuckled, the horrible raspy sound emanating from his throat failing to convey any form of amusement to the horrified prison guard held captive in the room with him. Perhaps villains needed to stop picking names that started with the letter M. They didn't seem to be having a good track record here. Izuku was just going to ignore the fact that he sensed the hero killer stain in Kurogiri moments later. It'd have ruined the small amount of humor he found in the situation. Shaking his head, Izuku focused in on Kai's location, activating his terrible warping quirk. It wasn't quite like Kurogiri's warp gate, in that it could only bring people to and from the quirk's user. Still though, it was all Izuku needed. He sensed that a puddle of exceptionally dark blue liquid pooled on the floor in front of him, which meant that the stuff must have produced next to no heat. As the pool transformed into a large pillar of goo, he noticed a struggling red and green form thrashing about inside the mixture, tainting the deep blue with shades of color as the struggling transferred enough energy into the liquid to signify a temperature change. The sludge eventually disappeared altogether, leaving behind the lithe form of Kai Chisaki grasping at his neck with the stubs where his hands used to be. It was hard to make out with his infrared vision, but Izuku thought he could see the splotches on his skin where Kai was beginning to develop hives. Izuku scoffed at the coughing germaphobe, desperately trying to take in a satisfactory breath of air. All fha, ak, all for one. The former villain managed to hack out, his eyes staring at the sunken splotches of scarred skin where Izuku's eyes used to be. Or were they where All for One's eyes used to be? Izuku shook his head as he placed his hand on Chisaki's head. He didn't have time for this, it was getting harder and harder to breathe by the second. "Don't touch, Arkhg, me," he cried, but it was far too late. For just a second, Izuku felt pity. Felt that what he was about to do was beyond cruel. But then he remembered what Kai had subjected Eri to, and what he had done to Sir Night-Eye and Mirio. The rest was surprisingly easy. Pulling on that mental trigger that constituted the quirk of All for One, Izuku felt a surge of power go through his hand on Kai's forehead. He noticed that in his infrared vision, his hand actually dropped its temperature for a few moments before rapidly heating back up to one of the deepest reds he'd ever seen. Arrrgh. Izuku barely heard Kai's scream of agony as his dreadful quirk was removed from the murderer's body. He was so in awe of the power he felt coursing through his veins and eventually, his entire body. While it only lasted about 3 to 5 seconds, he'd not felt a rush of power like that since he'd last used full cowl in his old life. He really wanted to slow down, to have the time necessary to process everything that was going on. What he was doing, if it was worth it, but he didn't have time. It was almost impossible for Izuku to get a satisfactory breath anymore, and he heard talk of hostages from the hallway, no doubt meaning they were already discussing strategies to bust the door down and take him out. He could feel it inside him, Chisaki's quirk. That terrible power of his, overhaul. It really was a shame Chisaki turned out to be a horrible person, his quirk was exceptionally versatile. It doesn't matter, he croaked, turning his own hand on himself and placing it upon his damaged throat. Izuku would make sure to put Kai's quirk to good use. That man, he didn't deserve such power. Thanks to All for One's capability of having a basic grasp of the quirks he stole, Izuku was already mentally preparing himself for the task of repairing his damaged body. Izuku hoped his lack of knowledge in the field of biology wasn't going to impede him in his task, as that would mean he'd need to resort to Plan B. Plan A was to simply work on repairing his lungs, using overhaul to fix the damage like how Kai was able to heal himself and his subordinates with his power. However, All for One's quirk informed him that his hypothesis about overhaul was correct. Kai could manipulate and change matter, not create it. Seems the law of conservation of mass held up even under the physics logic-defying reality of quirks. Izuku could not create a new lung out of thin air. It was his hope to use other parts of his flesh to fix the damaged bits, and let super regeneration cover up any damage he accrued from cannibalizing himself for the job. Plan B piggybacked off super regeneration as well, but Izuku wasn't keen to try it. As he'd been all too aware of throughout his entire stay at Tartarus, he was coughing up blood. Even the doctors couldn't stop him from doing it, his lungs were just broken, much like All Might's. That meant there was an open wound in his chest, which, by extension, meant super regeneration wasn't functioning correctly where his lungs were concerned. Sure, it couldn't heal scarred tissue, but scarred tissue didn't bleed. Scars were what formed when the body healed. Something in his chest was just wrong, and Izuku was very afraid that it was the organs themselves. If he ripped out his lungs, there was a 50-50 chance that he'd either grow a brand new pair of perfectly functional ones, or he'd totally ruin his chances of, well, living. Honestly, it was even less than a 50-50 chance. All for One had super regeneration for several years, and a damn doctor at his side nearly 24/7. Super regeneration was fast, but not impossible to get around. There were certainly speed-enhancing quirks and surgical tools that could be used to outpace get around the regeneration factor. Izuku highly doubted that the intellectual powerhouse that was Dr. Kyudai Garaki hadn't considered the idea of just using super regeneration to grow a brand new pair of lungs before, which meant for whatever reason, the idea had been considered and promptly discarded. If All for One wasn't willing to do it, Izuku certainly wasn't keen on figuring out why, since All for One's health problems were now his health problems. It was particularly odd when the quirk kicked in. It was like his thermal vision was switched off and he found himself in a blackened void, surrounded by nothing but grayscale representations of the object he was working on. In this case, it was himself. He wasn't going to look a gift horse in a mouth though. He was concerned that he wouldn't be able to see his work properly with thermal vision being a major limiting factor, not to mention the fact he had to uncomfortably crane his neck downwards just to peer inside his chest, but the grayscale removed that issue. The smile on his face grew a small bit as his hands operated with the skill of a dozen surgeons, pulling the skin of his chest away with near-practiced ease, pushing apart the muscle fibers, ribs, and other organs that blocked the path to his lungs. By the time he'd reached his destination, Izuku was able to determine that they were rather pitiful lungs. They looked blackened, veiny, and more closely resembled something he'd seen in those anti-smoking PSAs his middle school forced him to watch during health class. Each passing second chipped away at his resolve as the already daunting task he'd set out to do became all the harder. Izuku shook his head and was thankful that overhaul slowed down his perception of time. He didn't have to focus on his near inability to breathe right now, and could just focus on the task at hand. If ever there was a time to go plus ultra, it was now. All Might always said that it was important to think about quirk usage in an easy-to-understand manner, and back when he was wielding One for All, he went for the egg in the microwave, desperately trying not to make the egg, his old body, explode. In this case, the quirk overhaul was like, yes. This was exactly like playing with Legos. Every molecule was a brick, and while he didn't have an instruction manual to follow to piece things back together, he could see his lungs looked crooked. With a literal flick of his fingers, he cracked one of his lungs open like a walnut and blanched at the severely damaged structures inside. His damn trachea, what he could see of it anyways from his awkward, upside-down position, looked like it had been set on fire, and his, well, he believed the correct term was, bronchi, were pitiful, as were the alveoli they connected to. Of all the things Izuku hadn't expected to happen today, struggling to remember his anatomy classes wasn't one of them. In any case, most of those internal structures were, much like the flesh of his lungs, blackened and shriveled. With quite literally desperate energy, he started tearing the damaged and clearly non-functioning structures apart, looking for any sort of usable material. Underneath all the blackened gunk was gray gunk, which Izuku hoped was viable tissue. What looked like healthy parts of his lung were grayish, so the young man hoped this was a close enough situation. Izuku's respect and disgust for Kai increased yet again. His knowledge of the human body must have been unparalleled. The former Greenette easily acknowledged that the man could have been a scientist at Island with his intelligence, something Izuku already privately suspected was the case back when he was rescuing Eri from his clutches. The former Yakuza boss was the head researcher in his own personal laboratory, and while his methods were unnecessarily cruel and sloppy in the name of efficiency, why waste time drawing blood when you can just make someone explode and collect the runoff, he still developed quirk erasing bullets by somehow managing to devise a method of not only activating someone's quirk, Ares rewind, from cells that had been removed from the original host's body, and then somehow shoved the technology inside a fucking bullet. That knowledge only made Midoriya hate the man all the more. Izuku continued to rip all the gray chunks away, setting them off to the side, and wasn't that weird, setting chunks of his own lungs off to the side of his lungs before very carefully taking apart what was clearly a healthy bronchi and alveoli. He studied their structures, looking at how all the molecules seemed to fit together like the Lego bricks they were, and after he felt confident enough, that is to say, not at all confident, he slowly started assembling all those gray chunks he'd set aside earlier into mostly perfect replicas of the healthy parts he'd observed. To the outside observer, his hands were moving faster than a speeding bullet as blood sprayed out of his chest. To Izuku, he was building his own Lego set, doing his best to make it look nice and neat. 2 seconds had passed in the real world, but it felt more like 5 hours to Izuku. Thankfully, he'd yet to feel any pain, but he knew that as soon as he stopped using overhaul, his nervous system would kick in and it'd be a struggle to just remain conscious. He had managed to assemble the Lego house that was his lungs, and in what he would consider a semi-decent manner. Quite frankly, he was rather disheartened by the final product, but it was the best he could do. By his own estimates, he'd removed, very nearly, 43% of his lungs. Considering they were already shrunken and damaged before he started his task, that meant he'd removed a little less than half of what remained of his lungs. He didn't need to be a mathematician to know that wasn't good, by any definition of the word. On the bright side, what was left consisted only of totally healthy or partially healthy tissue. Anything that looked like it could squeeze out even a molecule of oxygen, Izuku kept. All the remaining necrotic tissue that resembled charcoal more than anything else was lumped into squishy, disgusting ball of flesh and blood floating in front of Izuku, which he was perfectly content to let drop to the floor to be forever forgotten. He was quite certain he'd be breathing better than he was before, the only question was, would better be enough? Only one way to find out, really. The former Greenette grabbed the ribs he'd removed from his chest cavity and let float around in the void that surrounded him, clicking them back into place as easily as one would stick a magnet onto a slab of iron. His other organs were arranged in a neat fashion, the muscle fibers and skin gently laid back atop his chest like a blanket slid atop a mattress. Izuku inevitably ran into another problem because his life seemed to be one car crash after another. Once, that metaphor was quite literal, and his hopes of feeling any sort of decent after this impromptu surgery plummeted. His neck was, without a doubt, riddled with holes, and his esophagus felt like it was loaded with scar tissue. While Izuku could crane his neck down to peer inside his chest, he couldn't do the same thing for his throat. While he had a rubbery limbs quirk that he could utilize to stretch himself around like Mr. Fantastic to acquire the correct angle, he wasn't entirely sure how well that would translate with his wounds, nor how that might impact his surgery. Hell, he wasn't even sure he'd be able to fix himself with a mirror if he had one, because that was diving into the mechanics of how his vision worked with this weird grayscale overhaul provided. Was this simply piggybacking off of his thermal vision quirk, or was overhaul providing him with an entirely separate method of vision? If it was just piggybacking off thermal, he wouldn't be able to utilize a mirror in any way, shape, or form. Gritting his teeth, Izuku realized he'd need to do a patch job of some sort if he wanted his work to have any effect, so he tore himself open and fumbled around with his hands to search for any issues in lieu of visual confirmation. If he felt rough scar tissue, he tore it off and smoothed it over with nearby flesh like he was spreading butter onto a slice of bread. Holes, he treated much the same. He could only hope the flesh he was cannibalizing for the job wasn't too important in its original position. This was seriously cutting into his chances of actually making it out of here, but Izuku mustered up the willpower and resolved to do the best job he possibly could, even when he was performing his own surgery blind. He needed to get out of Tartarus. He unequivocally refused to get back in that chair. If a guard stood between him and freedom, the opposite of getting strapped back into that literal torture device, he wasn't sure the guard would be walking out of that situation alive. If worst came to worst, he wasn't even sure he wouldn't purposely cut himself down to prevent that from happening, even if it meant Ragdoll would never get her quirk back. With that in mind, he resigned himself and figured that he'd done the best job he could considering his limitations. Izuku folded the skin of his esophagus and neck back over, before canceling out overhaul, only to immediately collapse onto his knees, fighting to remain conscious as mind-numbing agony coursed through his entire body. Searing, startling, blinding white-hot pain flooded his every thought as the skin upon his chest flew off his muscles, before those two were tossed callously out into the side. Ribs popped right out of his chest while his lungs exploded and then imploded immediately afterwards in a matter of seconds as everything else painfully reassembled itself to a state of perfection. Just as quickly as that pain appeared, it ended. Izuku had suffered from a condition known as sciatica in his old body, wherein the muscles in his leg would occasionally squeeze down, crush, or otherwise rub the sciatic nerve that ran down one's leg, even though said nerve was not meant to be crushed or squeezed down upon. The end result was an exceptionally painful sensation, actually rivaling that of when he broke his bones. The thing about sciatica though, was that the pain was instantaneous and didn't linger. It was pure agony for the split second when he felt it, but then it'd go away just as quickly, not even a hint of tenderness or soreness left behind. Of course, it'd return as soon as the muscles clamped down on the nerve, but the blinding pain was there and gone in a flash. That was exactly what using overhaul on himself felt like. Suffering on an immense scale, for but a few seconds. His nerve endings were torn apart, and then pieced back together as if nothing was wrong. He felt far better than he had before he used the quirk, and while the pain was definitely seared into his memory, his chest felt considerably better off than it had before. He wasn't quite able to tell if there was any pain through the mental aftershocks that had him reeling, but for the first time in 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 51 minutes and 8 seconds, Izuku took a fairly painless breath of fresh, non-machine supplied air. It seemed that he wasn't able to take a very deep breath, but again, he was still breathing under his own power without too much issue now. He could, without a doubt, work with this. The smile that graced his face was probably thin and crooked, but it was made with genuine happiness. Forcing himself back onto shaky legs, Izuku's infrared vision noticed the guard's hands, once raised in the air, had flown to his mouth and were poorly holding back a spray of liquid that spouted out around his fingers. His eyes seemed to be focused on a greenish-orange, rapidly deforming ball on the floor in front of Izuku, but then again, it was hard to tell which way he was looking in thermal vision. The guard promptly decided to punch out from his shift in the waking world, as his body slumped over and he promptly slid out of his chair, face first into the aforementioned ball. That ball was probably all the bits of his discarded lungs, now that he thought about it. Actually, no, he didn't want to think about it, because then he might want to vomit too. In an act of mercy, Izuku rolled the guard off the lump of discarded necrotic flesh with his foot, before turning his attention back to Chisaki's still twitching form. It was time for Izuku to escape. He'd just used Chisaki's quirk to make a tunnel underground and bail through there. As a bonus, he could even use overhaul to erase any evidence of his tunnel having existed as soon as he was done using it. Truly, the power to manipulate matter itself was a frightening one. It was too bad Chisaki seemed content to just build massive spikes to impale people with. He could have been a powerful doctor, or an infallible sculptor with a gift like this. Not to mention, all the possibilities of what he could have done as a hero. Izuku felt something bubbling up inside him, the unbridled yet normally suppressed rage he felt as Izuku stitched together with the calculating coldness and tendency to gloat of all for one. Words came spilling out of his mouth before he even thought of saying them. I never, thought I'd say this but I must thank you, Kai Chisaki. You squandered your gift when you used it to torture Eri, and killed anyone who stood in your way. Now though, I see you for what you actually are. You were simply a vessel designed for the explicit purpose of ferrying me this wonderful quirk, weren't you? Izuku said, his voice much clearer than it had previously been. It still wasn't what Izuku would consider healthy, but it was better than his previous, 80-year-old smoker, voice. He was struggling to breathe around his words, but he was still doing it. It'd suffice for now. His musings were cut off by the all for one. We know you're in there. Release the hostage and surrender yourself peacefully, no one has to get hurt. It's impossible to break out of Tartarus. By that, Izuku smacked his head to focus his mind, he was running out of time. He was equal parts relieved and disappointed that he wouldn't have the time he wanted to torture Kai for everything he'd put Eri through, but he had a prison to escape from. Still, he'd be leaving Chisaki with a parting gift. Right, yeah, how about no? I'm way too young to die in prison. Well, technically speaking anyway. I suppose it's not. It's, not. Izuku realized the issue before it became one, and smacked himself upside the head to stop his mumbling before it progressed any further. He didn't have time for that, not to mention his habitual motormouth wasn't exactly compatible with his new inability to properly breathe. Quickly, he bent down and touched Chisaki, activating overhaul. Unfortunately for Kai or for Izuku, he wasn't entirely sure there wasn't much left of his hands that could be reassembled into appendages. In fact, there wasn't anything left, which meant Izuku had absolutely no idea on what to do. He wasn't about to overhaul himself again just to see what the internal musculature of a hand was supposed to be like, and he wasn't sure Kai would appreciate Izuku cannibalizing other parts of his body to acquire the necessary amounts of bone and flesh to remake them. Growling, Izuku was forced to concede that stealing, liberating overhaul from him would have to suffice for revenge. Punishment. Well, actually, no it didn't. There was always Plan C, after all. Thinking quickly, Izuku ripped apart the man's ribs much like he did his own, reaching down into his chest cavity and parting everything haphazardly as he reached for the man's lungs. Like the sharpest scalpel in existence, his fingers parted the flesh of Kai's organ and spread one wide open, his perfectly healthy bronchioles and alveoli fully visible in Overhaul's strange grayscale. It was tempting, oh so tempting, just to reach in and grab several handfuls of the stuff, just so he could rip himself apart again and stick Kai's healthy bits inside his own chest. The sole reason he didn't was because at the very last second, when his other hand had reached down to peel back his own chest, Izuku recalled several old biology lessons about organ transplants. In addition to the fact that Izuku wasn't sure what his new blood type was compared to Kai and he didn't feel like learning why doctors only gave blood transfusions to people with compatible types, there was the very real chance that his body would reject anything he removed from Chisaki and put inside himself, which would only compound his current issues. He might not have been as healed as he'd hoped to be, but he was still standing, and could barely breathe without assistance. Again, it'd have to do for now. Reluctantly, Izuku closed the man back up with the bare minimum of care he could muster, but he was about 99% sure everything was back in the correct place. Alright, 98% sure. Snapping out of Overhaul's grayscale was, again, jarring, and he couldn't hold back the coughing fit it sent him into, nor the flecks of blood he spat up from the action. AAAAAARRRGGH. It seemed that Izuku's exploratory surgery had woken up the former Yakuza leader, but the former Grenette paid him little mind. Welcome back to the waking world, my friend, he wheezed, feeling what he hoped was saliva and not blood start to trickle out the corner of his mouth and down his chin. Unfortunately, the pain he felt in his throat and the coppery taste in his mouth discounted that idea. This is my punishment for you. That quirk, the ability to manipulate molecules themselves, it's not your anymore. You don't deserve it. Do your best to recognize that this is what you get for torturing Eri and killing Sir Night Eye. Quadruple A Ura. Sheesh, talk about a broken record. Izuku wasn't entirely sure Kai heard any of his rant. Either way, he had bigger problems to contend with. Namely, a lack of oxygen. As the knocking on the door grew louder, Izuku barely held onto consciousness as he collapsed down to the tiled floor, struggling to take in not-so-deep gasps of air. He literally almost mumbled his way into unconsciousness this time. If the flickering of his thermal vision was any sort of indication, which was, well, he'd say it was an issue, but he was instead going to look on the bright side and treat it as motivation to get a move on. The flickering dissipated after a few seconds, so with renewed vigor, the marginally healthier man touched the floor with his hand and activated his appropriated quirk. As soon as Izuku did, a hole appeared in the ground and swallowed him whole, not unlike something from those old Looney Tunes shows. The door was finally kicked down and several heavily armored riot guards charged into the room, guns and quirks blazing, only to witness the gaping hole before them vanish in front of their very eyes, turning itself into a jagged mess of crisscrossing spikes that denied any and all entry into the escape route. A screaming, twitching, and hive-covered Kai Chisaki, a passed-out guard covered in what appeared to be blood and necrotic entrails, plus a circular section of spiked, untiled floor were all that remained in the room besides the similarly confused guards. Everyone shared looks with each other, unsure of how to proceed but silently acknowledging the facts at hand. All for one, had escaped Tartarus after nearly 3 years in captivity. For Izuku though, he knew the truth in that moment. All for one was gone, for the most part. Izuku had escaped Tartarus exactly 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 5 days, 0 hours, 1 minute and 4 seconds after waking up in the body of Japan's most notorious villain. It was time to find Ragdoll. Izuku continued to burrow through the ground at a leisurely pace, unfortunately not because he felt invincible, but because he was still having trouble with his breathing and felt like he might pass out if he pushed himself too much. Still, he did feel assured that no one was following behind him with a tunneling quirk. He had hastily constructed a series of crisscrossing spikes to block off his initial escape route in truly Kai-esque fashion, but it worked. After his initial panic spiking, however, he took the time necessary to properly reconstruct the matter. He shoveled out of the way. The room he escaped from once had a simple, black tiled flooring. If he took his time with reconstruction, he could have easily left the room in pristine condition and reassembled the tiles along the way out. He now understood why Kai relied so heavily on spikes when he fought, as they were perhaps the easiest thing to construct. The action of forming spikes was equitable to grabbing a fistful of sand and hurling it at someone's eyes. All Izuku had to do was grab and pull, and the spikes formed on command. It was reasonable to assume that eventually, heroes would attempt to drill through his spikes to follow Izuku's trail, so he was digging out small chunks of earth, moving forward, then turning around and reassembling it back to the state he found it in. Kai was simply so keen to use spikes in his battles because they were one of the fastest things he could construct, keeping with the flow of battle. Technically, Kai could spend hours in his grayscale representation of the world building up a veritable fortress with which to defend himself, but that would have snapped him out of a battle-ready state, not to mention time still moved, albeit slowly, while he worked. He used spikes because it was quick, efficient, and got the job done. Overhaul was, almost like a speed quirk in that regard. The quirk slowed Izuku's sense of time to the point of a turtle's crawl while accelerating his own bodily functions, which mostly just meant allowing him great speed with which he could use to construct matter. It took only about 5 or so seconds by Izuku's own estimation to build those spikes, but actually reassembling everything in a manner that closely resembled what he had previously destroyed took far, far longer. After spending close to an entire hour but actually just a few seconds in the real world reassembling the first section of dirt he removed, he came to an epiphany. Dirt didn't exactly have a shape. He didn't need to assemble it in a way that looked exactly how he left it, he just needed to make it look like it hadn't been overhauled by himself. It still took about 10 minutes of his personal conception of time to assemble things back into a manner that looked natural, especially so whenever he ran into pipes or shells he felt a compulsion to reassemble perfectly. Seems his borderline OCD tendencies had stuck around from his old life. He'd have to start up his quirk analysis notebooks again, and he'd probably be spending page upon page writing about all the quirks now residing in himself. He would readily admit, he enjoyed Overhaul quite a bit. All for One's favorite quirk had been air cannons, largely because it was a quirk limited only by the user itself. The quirk on its own worked by expelling gusts of strong wind from the palm of its user's hand, but the strength of the blast was limited by the physical capabilities of its user to withstand the recoil caused by it. So, for example, if Izuku owned that quirk before he was trained by All Might, the gusts of wind he could create would be relatively pitiful as his body would automatically limit the amount of power he could output. Consequently, his blasts would have increased in strength after All Might had trained him and he gained some actual muscle for once. The sole reason air cannons were such a destructive force in All for One's hands was due to the sheer number of other quirks he combined with it to make his body able to withstand the generated knockback. Izuku had things other than pure destruction on his mind, however, which was why air cannons wasn't at the top of his quirk list. For Izuku, Overhaul was the perfect all-around quirk, able to fulfill nearly any role he could imagine. It could be used offensively, defensively, and even had the capability to heal. He could go toe-to-toe with combat-based villains one day, and then be hailed as an amazing rescue hero the next for performing several surgeries in the middle of a disaster zone. Painful surgeries, but still. He knew Ochako was rubbing off on him in his old life when he kept thinking of being her partner in the hero business. Her, the talented rescue hero, and him, the personal protection muscle. Then again, Ochako kicked his ass several ways to Sunday in combat training when students weren't allowed to use their quirks, so she probably didn't require as much protection as Izuku would have liked. He shook his head to dispel thoughts of the round-faced beauty, his chances with that were long gone. That'd continue to be one of his biggest regrets. Never telling her how he actually felt. He was far too scared of ruining their friendship to ever consider confessing, not to mention the overwhelming fear of just disappointing her. She could never like Izuku, he was just Izuku. Pathetic. Weak. Only had friends of any sort because of a quirk that wasn't even his own. If All Might hadn't given that to him, he'd still be living with his mother and probably working a low-paying job for the rest of his life. Assuming he would even be alive. Quirkless people always had it rough in the job market, even for jobs that didn't remotely require quirks. Why hire the quirkless kid to work the cash register when you could hire the guy who could adjust the height of his own body at will? The one with the quirk was far more interesting. Man, Kachan would be pissed if he could see Izuku right now. He was positively livid when Izuku first exhibited All Might's quirk. Now that he had several hundred inside him, well, he'd probably explode in rage. More so than usual, anyways. No. That life was over. Stop thinking about the past, you damn Deku, he chastised himself, fighting back yet another cough and patching up a section of dirt and gravel with his new quirk. Turning around, his hands rapidly disassembled more terrain and he momentarily paused when he came upon a concrete wall after shoving the dirt molecules aside like they weighed nothing. A house foundation perhaps. It was a man-made wall, that was for certain, but what was on the other side? Canceling out Overhaul, he found himself puzzled by the obstacle in front of him. It would take little to no effort to move it aside with Overhaul. Anything he touched became like wet paper for Izuku to mold into anything he desired. But he didn't know what was on the other side. What if the wall was flimsy? It was underground, so it had the potential to be a foundation for a building. What if this was the only good foundation, and Overhaul would compromise the structural integrity of whatever was on the other side? Or, what if it was filled with water or something? Izuku didn't exactly fancy drowning, though he did have quirks to combat that now that his lungs were sort of functional, but he didn't know if Overhaul would work on, or when surrounded by water, nor if that underwater breathing quirk would function well enough. Quirks had been cancelled out by stranger things. Perhaps being surrounded by a liquid would impair his ability to mold the molecules of whatever he touched. It was also incredibly hard to see down here. Everything was pretty cool, temperature-wise, so it was all nearly the same exact shade of blue, and it was only through the utilization of Overhaul's grayscale representation of the world that he was actually able to discern that he was moving forward, and vague outlines of the things he was disassembling. If only he had eyes. He'd overhaul his head to assemble some functioning eyeballs, but he didn't think he could do that due to multiple issues. The sole reason he was able to fix his lungs was because though they were damaged, some parts of it still functioned. Izuku could literally see, which, again, was still weird since he didn't have eyes, what the alveoli and bronchioles inside him looked like. and simply rearrange the molecules of his lung cells around to make structures that looked exactly like those did. Even if that was a non-issue, he still wouldn't be able to see properly. It'd be the issue with his throat all over again. He'd need like a mirror or something, or would he? Hands touched the scarred visage he now called his own face, tracing over the spots where his nose should be and the hollowed skin pockets that covered his eye sockets. Perhaps, it may work. Worst comes to worst, it'd just be a small momentary pain that super regeneration took care of with ease, and at best, his problem was solved. Nodding to himself, Izuku got to work. Super regeneration was unable to heal wounds that were scarred over, or cauterized. It blocked the healing process. So, Izuku took that knowledge to its logical conclusion. The scarring literally blocked the healing process and didn't outright cancel it. It was like a traffic jam on the road, stopping cars from going forward. If Izuku removed the blockade, super regeneration should theoretically kick in and heal the wounds. Plus, if he was wrong in his hypothesis, super regeneration would just grow the scarred tissue back over his face. To test it out, Izuku overhauled just a small portion of his new face, right where his nose should be. It was the work of a moment to simply peel the skin off of his skull, and though he knew it'd hurt, he wanted to give super regeneration the most amount of healthy tissue to work with. Basically, he scraped away far deeper than just the topmost layer of his skin, peeling away and discarding most of the tissue until he had almost reached his skull. Resigning himself, Izuku deactivated overhaul. His teeth grit in frustration as he felt a large chunk of his flesh straight up ripped from his skull, grimacing at the pain. Surprisingly, it wasn't the worst thing he ever felt, but it still wasn't pleasant. Even through the pain though, he found himself smiling as super regeneration activated, and he felt a new protrusion and cartilage form upon his face. Within seconds, the fleshy mass humans called a nose had finally formed upon the face of All for One, and Izuku felt the stirrings of a second emotion he'd not experienced in quite some time. Satisfaction. He rapidly tore away the rest of his face with abandon, peeling off the entire top layer of his scarred head and face, quite literally exposing the skull around his eye sockets as there wasn't much flesh to start with in the first place. The holes that were still present on the sides of his head where his ears used to be had the scarred tissue removed from the area, and Izuku ripped off the remaining damaged skin that trailed down to the back of his neck. If he could see his head, he knew it'd look like someone had tortured him with his visible sinews and skull glistening with fresh blood. But he didn't care. Even the pain he was about to experience wouldn't hold a candle to the sheer elation of his discovery. Hell, he wanted to go out and find someone with a painkilling quirk just so he could rearrange his face however he wanted without pain. Actually, he did have a painkilling quirk, but he only had the capability of directing it onto someone right in front of him for a few minutes at a time, and it couldn't be used upon himself. Maybe if he found someone with a painkilling quirk that worked on themselves he could propose a quirk swap. That's not a bad idea, he mumbled, even as his flesh bubbled and expanded around his bleeding and exposed skull. He may literally be able to give himself plastic surgery to look like, well, however he wanted. He may even be able to mold his body into an appearance identical to his old body, even though the chance was small. It was something he'd ponder later. He could undoubtedly give himself back his old appearance, but the real question was, would super regeneration accept the new position of his molecules, or would it attempt to rearrange himself back into the original shape of All for One? He supposed it depended on what activated super regeneration. Was it physical damage, or anything that altered the form of its user's body? By the time he finished his thoughts, he didn't feel any more of the throbbing pain that encompassed his entire head. Super regeneration had finished its job, whatever that happened to be. Turning off infrared vision, he found himself in total darkness. With a cough, Izuku berated himself. You're in an enclosed cave, dipshit. Of course you can't see anything. Shaking his head in shame, he activated hot hands. The lips on his face that were once only slightly upturned at the corners bloomed into a full-on, toothy grin as he finally saw the wrinkles on his new palms, glowing red and white from the heat radiating off his extremities. He flipped his hands around, in total awe of the sight of his fingernails, the minuscule amount of hair on his arms, the blood-soaked white prison jumpsuit and tattered remains of the straitjacket he wore, all cast in the orange glow of light coming from his hands. He was quite thankful it was his blood that soaked through the fabric, idly remembering a bit of it spraying out of him while he ripped his chest apart back in the prison. He just kind of assumed that the blood would stay inside his chest for some reason, even as he literally ripped things out of it without a care in the world. While he was definitely in pain, it wasn't unbearable and he didn't feel lightheaded. Couldn't be that bad. There were more important things to think about. Now, he could keep moving forward with his plans since he had functioning eyeballs again. Izuku had a new goal before he found Ragdoll though: find a mirror. He was pretty desperate to see if his face looked normal. Right, stay focused. No time to get distracted. All for One had several quirks that were rendered useless due to the injuries inflicted upon him by All Might, such as quirks that increased the amount of time he could hold his breath for which he still couldn't quite use properly, ocular quirks that allowed him to see through any material as much or as little as he desired, one that turned his eyes into what amounted to flashlights, and even a quirk that allowed him to bend his previously non-existent earlobes as much as he wanted. He cocked a recently formed eyebrow at the thought, activating the eyelights quirk in addition to the largely unimportant earlobe quirk, and started questioning reality as he bore witness to his earlobes dancing and shaking around in front of his vision while he twisted them around like unbaked pretzel dough. He was a poor man's Kyoka. Man, he was really bad at this whole "don't think about the past" thing. Izuku shook his head and went back to the obvious question at hand. At what point did All for One decide, yes, I need to steal this person's ability to manipulate their earlobes? Who does that? He asked no one in particular, his hand reaching up to rub the back of his head in confusion. He noticed there was a large quantity of hair beneath his hand, which meant that he wasn't bald anymore. Was it super regeneration that grew his hair back? Or did he unknowingly activate some sort of hair growing quirk or something? Izuku shook his head to dispel the confusing thoughts. He had a wall to get through, and breathing to focus on. Activating his now usable X-ray vision quirk, he was able to glance through to the other side of the concrete. It appeared to be the wall of a tunnel or underpass of some kind, and he could see straight through to the other side like someone had replaced the solid rock with see-through glass. There was a single, shaggy individual with a wrinkled face and a highly unkempt beard dressed in a ragged coat warming himself by a barrel with a fire lit inside it in a small, dirty tent nearby. Obviously, the man was homeless. The walls around him appeared to be covered in graffiti, and it was dark everywhere else not touched by the glow of the flame. So, either he was in some underground tunnel, or it was night outside. There wasn't a road going through the place, and it looked more like some kind of unused and abandoned footpath that had long since fallen into disrepair. He could have gone around and found another place to exit his self-made tunnel from, but he didn't really care. What hope could one homeless man have against the veritable arsenal of quirks at Izuku's fingertips? With that thought in mind, he shrugged and activated Overhaul, this time electing to remove a perfectly Izuku-shaped hole in the wall in front of him, stepping through the new opening much to the surprise of the vagrant. He now had a flair for dramatic entrances, it would seem. Could be worse, he supposed. The man eyed Izuku curiously but didn't say anything. Additionally, he didn't appear to be scared witless, so his face must have been properly healed from his improvised plastic surgery session. "Greetings," Izuku said, bowing slightly to the ragged man across the tunnel. Hey, he may be in the body of a villain, but that didn't mean he had to be impolite. It was also nice that he didn't seem to be stuttering much anymore. His old self probably would have tripped over a simple, hello. Bonus points for the confidence boost. He'd probably still have to deduct those points thanks to his new borderline sadistic tendencies, however. "Whatcha want, My money. Ain't got nothin', you ruffian. If you're gonna hurt me just get it over with then, The man barked, barely even sparing Izuku a second glance as he turned his attention back to the warming fire. The outburst actually surprised Izuku. He expected the man to turn tail and flee, and he'd be lying if he said he didn't want him to drop his wallet. Hey, he'd need money. Izuku wasn't being cruel, he was simply practicing moral relativism. Yeah, that sounded good. While money would be appreciated, I have no intention of harming you. I must inquire however, why would you assume me to be some sort of villain? He offered the man his most reassuring smile, hoping beyond hope that the wetness he could feel trailing from the corner of his mouth was just saliva and not blood, while spreading his arms wide in what he hoped was a welcoming manner. The man cocked an eyebrow at Izuku, staring him down. "Ya mean aside from blood-soaked Tartarus jumpsuit?" "Ah. Yeah, that'd explain it. He'd need to ditch that. Could he overhaul himself some new clothes? Or maybe he could ask the man for some. And if he refused then maybe he'd steal his." No, that was wrong. The man obviously needed them, even by the fire he was shivering. Now that Izuku thought about it, he was shivering too. Geez, it really was cold outside tonight. Without even thinking, Izuku had approached the man's barrel and mimicked his movements, standing as close as he could to the flames with his palms outstretched in an attempt to warm himself up. He also may have stopped halfway over to lean to the side and spit a mouthful of blood onto the cracked concrete floor beneath him. Despite all that, the man merely scoffed and kept his attention directed at the source of warmth, barely paying Izuku any heed whatsoever. The former greenette found himself lost in the sight of the fire, as it was the first time he had properly seen, well, anything in quite a long time. He observed the various scrapes and spots of rust on the sides of the barrel, the little embers that floated up into the darkened tunnel from the various newspapers and twigs shoveled inside the roaring flame while he listened to the crackling of said material as it burned to ash. A minute of this uncomfortable silence passed before Izuku decided to speak once more. "You're oddly calm despite being next to an escaped convict. One from Tartarus, no less. You must have a rather, powerful quirk if you think it can protect you." Izuku drawled, silently disgusted with himself. That sentence came out far more threatening than he had intended it to. But, he had to know. It was this desire in the back of his skull, he needed to know exactly what quirk this man had. If it piqued his interest, well, ain't got no quirk, sir. Just myself. So why don't we stop beatin' round bush and ya do what you gotta do. The way the man spoke, so resigned. It was a trip down memory lane, and an unwelcome one at that. From back in the days where Izuku would just take whatever was thrown at him because he knew that one, undeniable fact about himself. He was quirkless. Worthless Deku, you think you can hang with us? You know what comes next, don't ya? The small green-haired child merely nodded and hung his head, already preparing himself for the new burns and bruises he was about to receive. Still, he knew he'd find himself back at Kachan's side the next day. This was just tough love. Kachan and he were friends, Izuku knew it. He just had a different way of showing it. That didn't make the fist colliding with his face hurt any less, however. Izuku grit his teeth and let out an annoyed growl, and for the first time that night he got a reaction out of the ragged man. He flinched and looked away, in a manner all too similar to what Izuku had done as a child. He just accepted it. Figured he was going to get beat and took it, because there was nothing he could do. But now, what would Izuku do? For once, he was on the opposite side of the spectrum. Do you have a phone, old man?" The sigh that escaped his chapped lips ruffled the tangled and messy hair of his beard, but he nodded in resignation. His hands slowly reached into the tattered pockets of his coat and pulled out an older-looking model of phone, its screen cracked, stained, and damaged. Izuku took the offering and flipped it on, pleased there was no password he needed to enter and to proceed. It had about 50% of its battery left, which was more than necessary for what Izuku was going to do. He immediately clicked on the internet app and started creating a few tabs he could bounce back and forth between. He first searched up his old name, Izuku Midoriya, quickly flipping to a new tab before he could see the loaded results. He already knew exactly what it would say, but he wanted to postpone it all just a bit longer. Perhaps he could stave off the heartache he knew was coming. Secondly, he searched up the wild pussycats, hoping to find some clue as to their whereabouts. If worst came to worst, he could just go back to the location of the summer training camp and squat in their little woodland mansion until they returned. It'd be shelter over his head, at least. Plus, if they came to see who was using the water and electricity after they got their monthly bills, that'd certainly speed things up. He wasn't quite sure how he was going to get Ragdoll's quirk back into her, but he'd do it one way or another. If that method happened to be force, well, she was currently quirkless. She wouldn't be able to resist him. Shaking his head at the troubling thoughts brewing inside his head, he opened another tab and searched up All Might. That tab surprised him. The first thing he saw was an article about All Might fighting a villain yesterday. And in his muscle form, too. But how? That was impossible. Izuku died with One for All inside him. The only thing All Might should have had left within him would be embers. Izuku was the new flame of One for All. He clenched his fist and tried to activate full cowling, half expecting to see the familiar green surge of electricity dance across his skin. Nothing happened though, which confirmed that the quirk didn't travel from his old body and into All for One with him. A thought did occur to Izuku however. He quickly flipped back to the tab he had created about his former self, and felt his heart drop at the Wikipedia page he was greeted with. Izuku Midoriya was a provisionally licensed hero who studied at UA High. He didn't need to click the page to understand the rest. The presence of the word provided more than enough information. He did his best to dispel the news he already knew but wanted so badly to deny, by focusing on his train of thought. As far as Izuku knew, his situation would be the first time that someone who previously possessed the quirk of One for All outlived the one they passed the quirk onto. Perhaps, when Izuku died, the flame of One for All transferred itself back to the only living recipient of the quirk. All Might had said all the previous users died while fighting All for One, and they simply made sure to pass the quirk down to someone else before the fight occurred. Either UA's support course had done something magical beyond helping Hatsume blow the doors off of each and every classroom in the building, or this was a highly efficient imposter. But that left the other remaining question: how much time was All Might, or this copy of All Might, working with here? He was back in his muscle form. Izuku scrolled through several other articles and saw a few video thumbnails to prove that much to himself, and he decided to work off the assumption that this was indeed All Might himself. Before he had given One for All to Izuku, he had stated that his hero time had been cut to about 3 hours thanks to his wound, and that thing definitely wasn't getting any better, plus All Might had only grown older since then. Taking all that into account, All Might had at most 2.5 hours of hero time, and at the very least 30 minutes. However, if he had passed One for All onto someone else by now, his time may be reduced substantially again. Could he pass the quirk on again? Would he have to wait for the embers within him to fully reignite into the fire, or could he freely give it away once more? Izuku felt his hand tugging at the mass of hair atop his head in frustration, and he pulled out several strands with equal parts rage and curiosity. Holding them up to the fire, he finally found out his new hair color. White. He was old as shit now, wasn't he? Great. Izuku let the strands fall from his grasp and burn up in the flames, his eyes flickering briefly back to the ragged man beside him. He was curious and slightly apprehensive, if he had to take a guess as to the man's emotions. Obviously confused that he hadn't been murdered yet or left alone. He was clearly at a loss for what would happen next. Izuku flicked the power button on the side of the device, letting it fall into sleep mode so he could observe his reflection for the first time. The light of the fire cast enough of a glow off his face that his features reflected across the dark screen, plainly visible. He was fairly normal, thankfully. It seemed that his decision to rip all the skin off his head had worked out spectacularly, and his face was entirely healed, no more of that horrendous scarred tissue he had seen back in the Camino ward. His eyes were, actually, they seemed to be green, if he could go off the dim reflection, plus his hair was fairly well maintained and gave off a bedhead but proud vibe. The white color meshed pretty well with his new features. He didn't appear old, so it must have just been its natural color. He looked to be about 35 maybe. Somewhere around that age, though he knew himself to be much older due to that life force quirk he had that kept his features youthful. His nose was certainly larger than Izuku's former one had been, and it was slightly angular but, once again, it didn't look bad. He certainly could have found himself in a worse body. He would say he was ruggedly handsome. His face seemed oddly familiar though. Oh my god, it's your own face. Of course it's familiar. Izuku hoarsely shouted at himself, slapping a hand against his forehead in frustration. He ignored the homeless man's flinch at his sudden movement and the blood spraying from his mouth with the shout, most likely, and continued to berate himself mentally for his idiocy. The body-swapped teen had some of All for One's memories. Of course seeing his own face would strike a sense of familiarity with Izuku. With a sigh, he turned the phone back on and went back to the Wild Pussycats tab, scrolling through some of the recommended articles. He frowned as he thumbed past the 5th thumbnail that showcased the team, each and every photo missing a certain wide-eyed member with long, emerald green hair. It was just Mandalay, Pixie Bob, and Tiger in all the promotional images. Izuku flipped over to the images section of the search engine and grit his teeth at the picture he saw at the bottom of the screen. Tapping twice on it to bring himself directly to the website, he barely held back the curses building in his throat as he read through the article dated about 2 years ago, not too long after he found himself trapped in this new body. Former pro ragdoll pigs out on ice cream after forced retirement. The picture itself was of an obviously distraught ragdoll on what Izuku assumed to be the balcony of her own goddamned apartment, eating out of a pint of banana-flavored ice cream with tears rolling down her face in loosely fitting, baggy clothes. The picture was shot from down low, and far away, so it was obviously some paparazzi asshat invading her privacy for the money shot. The article itself was sensationalist garbage, and he idly noticed he was reading from one of those tabloid websites that made up 99% of everything they wrote and had intentionally misleading titles, yet he still found himself upset by the article. He knew Ragdoll had retired, the team stopped by UA's dorms to say hello, and he heard the full story. He found it nice that Ragdoll was still intent on helping the team, even if she wasn't going to be doing field work anymore. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and Izuku got all the information he needed from that one. Of course she wasn't content to lounge about an office taking calls and filing reports, she was a hero. The article mentioned the usual drabble he had barely paid heed to in his former life, all the speculation on what happened to her quirk. There was never any public explanation for what occurred. No one wanted to admit at the time that a man was on the loose with the power to steal quirks, so they mostly just let the media speculate and spread rumors to their heart's content. It seemed that the vultures had settled for the explanation of SIQL, or stress-induced quirk loss. It happened to pros occasionally, and even regular people. Quirks were like a mental muscle after all, and going through something traumatic could damage one's ability to utilize them. It was a spectrum, and most people who suffered from it didn't lose their quirk altogether, they just lost their ability to effectively control it. Medication and therapy could help, and it seemed the paparazzi jerk who snapped that ice cream photograph had tailed Ragdoll for quite some time, showing her dressed in a hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap in an obvious attempt to not be noticed entering a psychiatry office. The picture was accompanied by the truly illustrious caption of "Quirkless pussycat seeking counseling for trauma or eating disorder. See her shopping list below." Izuku turned the phone off after that. It wasn't like the article was horrendous slander, compared to some of the vitriol he'd read about Midnight or even All Might those news agencies wrote. This was relatively tame. But they didn't understand what she'd suffered through and were simply making fun of her inability to live up to the high standards of pro hero. He could already tell what other websites would be calling her, even the respectable ones. Every news agency did the same thing when a pro exhibited any struggles with their quirks. Top hero Kamui Woods becoming quirkless. Watch as he fails to save child from sludge monster. New scars signaling the end of Eraserhead's career. Could the underground hero soon become quirkless? All Might's true form revealed. Former pro gives first quirkless interview. He'd read all of those before, and he knew exactly what it meant. Quirkless was another word for weak. Helpless. A veritable disability in today's day and age. Someone with the power to extend their pinky toe had more value than an exact clone of that person without the quirk. Why? Because they had a quirk. Who cares what it is? A quirk's a quirk. Izuku grit his teeth and shoved the phone back towards the uneasy man standing next to him at the fire, unsure of how to proceed. He did eventually work up the courage to take the phone back and return it to his pocket. Izuku merely seethed in place for a few moments, trying to plot his next move. He resisted the urge to seek out and murder the paparazzi reporter. They were just doing their job, as scummy as it was. Murder was something Izuku thought about often, and was quite pleased with his ability to say no to the urge when it popped into his skull. 'Cause boy would it be easy. So easy. But Izuku wasn't all for one. He was still Izuku. Just, with a little extra. He'd adjust, he always did. Right, step 1, he needed clothes. There were several options to get them, and he'd figure something out. Step 2, shelter for the night. Izuku knew he had tunneled out pretty far from Tartarus, but he was still within an hour's distance of the place. There were bound to be cops and pros swarming the streets in record numbers very soon, if not a full-blown evacuation of wherever he was. The prison did not seem to have a particularly good handle on the problem when Izuku tunneled out, and it was entirely possible that they wouldn't. Wherever he was now, somewhere in the Chiba prefecture most likely, would be stop number 1 for Tartarus escapees. Step 3. Reevaluate his definition of barely functioning lungs. In the back of his mind, Izuku was doing every mental exercise he possibly could to keep his heart rate up, but it'd be falling pretty soon. This was bad, because he had a numbing quirk that assisted him in ignoring pain when his heart rate was above certain levels. Overhaul was sadly not the miracle cure he needed, and while he succeeded in keeping himself alive for now, he'd probably need to either risk ripping out his lungs and hope super regeneration would fix it, or get medical attention for his newish issues. The blood wasn't very concerning to Izuku. He could definitely feel where that was coming from, and that location was somewhere in his esophagus, not his lungs. Every time he coughed, he could literally feel the skin in his throat tear open, and then super regeneration would heal it right back up. When he was blindly shuffling around molecules to patch over the holes he could feel, he obviously left a patch or two of very thin skin in his wake. That was acceptable for now. The pain wasn't horrendous, and really, it was simply the inevitability of it all that grated on Izuku. It was going to tear, and he was going to have to either spit up or swallow the tiny amount of blood that he was leaking with each breath. He was joking when he said he should vomit blood more to emulate All Might. His lungs were functioning, now that he repaired some of their internal structures, at the cost of cannibalizing other parts of his own flesh to perform the deed. Now that they were smaller and still not operating exactly as they should, damn it, his breathing wasn't as good as he'd originally hoped it would be. The situation would need to be resolved within a few days. Step 4. Find Ragdoll. Invading the Woodland Mansion was a viable strategy, but knowing the Pussycats, they probably kept Ragdoll close. Even though they weren't related, the 4 of them all acted like a family, so even if Ragdoll wasn't there in the new promotional images, he was 78% sure she would be nearby. If he could find out where the Pussycats were operating at this moment in time, he could get near them and use Ragdoll's own quirk to find the woman. From there, well, he was shoving this quirk inside her one way or another. That sounded a lot worse than he wanted it to. But hey, how was he supposed to explain all this to the terrified woman? Hey, it's me, Izuku. I'm that 16, well, now 19-year-old kid that you talked to a tiny bit during that summer camp where you were attacked by villains and lost your quirk, and I know I kind of died about 3 years ago, but guess what? I now inhabit the body of the single most dangerous criminal in existence and want to give you back your stolen gift. So, want it back or something. Oh, and please don't tell anyone about my existence, I'm kinda trying to stay on the down low, you feel me? That wasn't even accounting for all the coughing and wheezing he'd been doing throughout the entire explanation either. Izuku took a break from his musings to spare another glance at the ragged man, who was now gaping at Izuku with his mouth hanging wide open. Ah.